research in London, and recently he has actually looked at a number of issues relating to globalization, voting, labor issues, inequality, economic growth. So truly a very broad grasp of very important key issues in economics. So we're very pleased to have him here, and I'm also pleased and thankful to Ambassador Dominic Kurgler from the Swiss Embassy, who has been the Swiss ambassador to the Czech Republic for over 2 years now. Before that, had important assignments as ambassador to the United Kingdom, to Egypt, among other things, and within the Swiss civil service system. So it's indeed a great pleasure to have everybody here. Thank you for coming. And Mr. Ambassador, would you say a few words?
Thank you, Professor Zweimüller. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me huge pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Swiss Embassy. And I would like, from the outset, to especially thank Professor Zweimüller for giving us his analysis of voting in Western Europe in recent years. You write here in the program, of course, that right-wing populism is on the rise. Traditional social democracy may be on the verge of collapse. When I look to some countries, I have the impression that, at least in some countries, also traditional liberal parties are struggling. And when it comes to Switzerland, which might not have been the center of your studies, but is still interesting, at least to me, we had parliament elections 2.5 weeks ago with a strong upward trend for the Greens and the Green Liberals, and on the other hand, losses for the still biggest party, but quite important losses for the right-wing, more nationalistic, conservative party. So I'm, of course, also wondering how this fits into your analysis, maybe in the question and answer session. So I'm very much looking forward to what you will be telling us, and I would also like to thank you, Professor Zweimüller, and all the team from CERGE-EI for the excellent cooperation. You mentioned it. We had an event 10 days ago. We had one last year on the Swiss professional education system, which led as a direct result to a study trip by a Senate delegation with Jiří Drahoš and other senators. So that's the way I really like it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. So let me just introduce Philipp Pertoldt. Many of you know him, leading scientist and director of a number of research projects within the Institute for Democracy and Economic Analysis, IDEA, and so he will be the moderator of today's speech and discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I don't have to say too much. Professor Zweimüller will talk about 45 minutes. You can ask technical questions during his talk, and after his talk there will be sufficient time for discussion, for sure. And then, of course, there is a reception prepared next door, so please do not run away immediately after his talk. So, Professor Zweimüller, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction, and thanks for coming. The talk of today will be about the role of globalization in voting behavior in Western Europe. And I will in particular talk about the rise of right-wing parties and the fall of social democracy. And as Mr. Ambassador has already mentioned, there are many other trends going on in voting behavior. We see, the landslide victory of the Green Party in Switzerland just a few weeks ago, and a trend that favors probably parties like that care about environmental issues quite a bit. But here I'm focusing actually on a longer-term perspective, and on the role of the globalization process that has, of course, important implications for voting behaviors. So one thing is, I want to start with that graph. That is something about which we are talking a lot. This is the rise of right-wing populism in Western Europe. And when I talk about Western Europe, I mean the EU 15 countries minus Greece, because for Greece we didn't get the data that we wanted to have, plus Switzerland and Norway. Okay, so this comprises a population of roughly 400 million individuals, from which 300 million individuals have the right to vote, and about 200 million have actually voted in the last election. So here we see that if we look on that graph, we see the number of voters that in that definition of Western Europe that voted for right-wing parties. And in 2019, which is last year, we have 25 million voters who voted in the last election for a right-wing party in these countries. And as you can see, this number has risen a lot from about 5 million in the early 1990s to about 25 million by the year 2019. Now, if you look at social democratic parties are, of course, traditionally part of the elite, of the political elite, and a lot of individuals and a lot of voters gave their vote to social democrats. And up to the mid-2000s, about 70 million voters gave their vote to social democrats. But since then, it seems that social democracy is falling off the cliff. Okay? Now we are down to like 45 million voters, and this means in terms of vote shares, by the early 2000s, roughly 35% was the vote share of social Democrats. Now this has fallen to somewhat more than 20%. So social democrats have lost dramatically. Now, if we think about these tectonic shifts in the political landscape of Western Europe, then political scientists point to two main explanations why this could have happened. These explanations are not necessarily competing explanations. Of course, both of them will be important and relevant. And the first one would allude to traditional values and identity of the voting population. And the argument would be that political elites have pushed liberal rights too far. Think about gender equality, gay rights, ethnic diversity, environmental protection. And this is not necessarily in the interest of the common people. It may be even against the will of ordinary people. Okay? This would, in contrast, we have explanations that rely very much on the economics and the globalization process, which has produced winners and losers over time, and there's an increasing divide between those who benefit from globalization and those who lose. And the argument is that the losers, the number of people who think that they are left behind, is increasing. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, both views are, of course, important and relevant, but what I want to do in this lecture today is to focus on the economic perspective and shed light on the potential role of globalization on voting behaviors. Now, let me start with a survey. This is just one example. There are many surveys out there shedding light on issues like this. And in this survey that was conducted by the Bertelsmann Foundation asked respondents, do you think that globalization is a threat? And it was a large survey. There were close to 15,000 respondents, and it was conducted in all EU countries. And first of all, what is interesting is that many voters actually say yes to this question. Overall, 45% of respondents would say globalization is a threat. There's of course a lot of variation across countries, but what we see in almost all countries is that voters or individuals who eventually voted for right-wing parties would disproportionately agree to that question. Okay? Now, similarly, if you ask them, has your economic situation deteriorated or is your future economic outlook bad? Also, a third of the respondents would say this is the case. Again, there's variation across countries, but what we see consistently across countries is that individuals who voted for right-wing parties would disproportionately agree to this statement. So this is a first kind of piece of evidence that kind of is consistent with the idea that globalization is driving populist votes in Western Europe or in Europe in general. Okay, so these feelings of economic anxiety and economic insecurity is also most prevalent among the less educated workers. There are particularly blue-collar workers would agree to these questions, and older individuals and male workers. Now, what I want to do in this lecture, I want to address more specifically how globalization affects voting and look at it. I'm an economist myself and look at this question from the economic perspective. Okay? So economic theory would tell us that globalization generates winners and losers, or I should be more broad. Economists would say globalization and trade is a good thing because it in principle could all individuals make all individuals better off. But in reality, if we just accept what markets, the market results that emerge, then globalization and trade will generate winners and losers. Okay? And what I want to focus in this lecture is on two aspects of the globalization process that are obviously important when it comes to political outcomes, namely, first of all, immigration, and second, international trade. Okay. And what I want to do in this lecture is first review empirical evidence of the previous literature, and then I want to talk about an ongoing project where I hope I can present you some actual empirical results from an ongoing project that are interesting. Okay. So let me first briefly talk about this economic narrative about the winners and losers of the globalization process. This simple model would say that we should think about labor market consequences, and on this labor market we have high-skilled and low-skilled workers. The high-skilled workers would be the productive workers that earn high wages. Low-skilled workers are less productive, earn lower wages, may have also problems on the labor market, high unemployment rates, and so on. So this is what such a model would, in a straightforward way, generate. Now, if we have a shock on such a labor market, an immigration shock, where a lot of immigrants come into the country that are disproportionately low-skilled. In the majority of countries, actually Switzerland here is an exception. In Switzerland we have many high-skilled immigrants. But in most Western European countries, immigrants are disproportionately low-skilled. So this means on this labor market, the relative supply of low-skilled workers increases, meaning that low-skilled native workers face higher competition on the labor market, see their wages under pressure, and see increasing employment problems. Okay? So the consequence will be deteriorating labor outcomes, labor market outcomes for low-skilled workers, which may translate into kind of political preferences that are directed against, that they develop anti-immigration attitudes. The second dimension that is important in the globalization process in this context is import competition. So what many countries, I mean almost all rich countries have seen in the recent decades is increasing imports from low-income, low-wage countries. Think about China, okay, and locations and industries that had to compete with these Chinese firms became increasingly under pressure, saw their profits eroding, had to downsize and lay off workers. Many plants had to be closed down. And this essentially meant that kind of the relative demand for low-skilled workers was decreasing. As a consequence, low-skilled workers face weaker labor market conditions, again see their wages under pressure, face lower weaker labor market prospects, and therefore are disproportionately hurt. So this is the economic narrative. Okay? Now, what is the empirical evidence about these winners and losers? First of all, the model, this simple model, captures an important fact, namely the skill premium. The skill premium is the persistent wage difference between low and high skilled workers. And it also can easily capture persistently higher unemployment and non-employment rates for the low skilled. Okay? Now, if we then say, many studies are out there that studied how immigration affects labor markets of host countries. Okay? There's interestingly not very strong evidence of a negative effect of the low-skilled natives through immigration. Okay. Actually, we did also a study for Switzerland where we studied this, and we don't find any strong impact of the huge increase in immigration actually that Switzerland experienced on employment chances and also on wages of native workers. And there actually are other studies out there in Switzerland that find similar things. Okay. But even if immigration does not actually negatively affect the low-skilled, this is not really the relevant thing. It depends what the perception of the voters is. And it's completely suffice if voters think the immigrants take away my jobs to make them kind of allude to anti-immigrant campaigns. Somewhat different, what we see the empirical evidence somewhat different if it comes to imports from low-income countries. Okay, there's one important study. This is I will come back to that study again. It's actually by my Zurich colleague David Dorn and his co-authors about the China shock and its impact on local labor markets in the US. And they actually find there's a strong negative effect of import competition on US local labor markets. And this actually is potentially also important to explain why in these locations Trump and other politicians had disproportionate success. Now let me go to the existing literature and ask the question, what does the literature tell us about did immigration cause the rise of right-wing parties? Okay. Now, of course, if you think about the role of immigration for voting, not only labor market considerations are relevant. Okay, we think about schools, for instance, or we think about the housing market or crime, and so on. Okay. And of course, also preferences and the values and beliefs and perception of the voters matter. And this dimension has been kind of studied extensively in the political science literature and in sociology. For instance, there is one important hypothesis here would say that there's the collective threat hypothesis. So if there's a lot of immigrants coming into the country, natives may feel a collective threat since their economic, social, and cultural values are challenged by these strong minorities. Okay. Now another hypothesis would say social cohesion erodes when we have a lot of ethnic diversity in a society. Okay, this is an argument that was put forth by Putnam, an important sociologist. And in contrast, there is also the contact hypothesis that says lack of interaction with immigrants may actually generate a lot of xenophobic attitudes, but as soon as you get in touch with immigrants in actual daily interaction, then this reduces the prejudice against the minority group. Okay? So there are many hypotheses out there, so it's not completely clear how immigration will affect voting. So let's look at the empirical evidence. So I'm Austrian myself, and I did a study on the rise of the right-wing party, the FPÖ in Austria. And this is a campaign poster of this party in the, not in the last, but in the second to last election, when H.C. Strache, the guy who had to resign, the vice chancellor who had to resign recently, was still the boss of this party. And as you can see from that poster, I mean, this party took a very strong anti-immigration stance, and the poster said we need to stop Islamization. Okay? Now, if we look at the evolution of this, of the importance of this party, then this we see these are the blue bars. We see that this party was relatively unimportant up until the mid-1980s, when Jörg Haider took over the party. And this in 1986, this party gained the substantial amount of votes for the first time. And thereafter, the increase in vouchers for the FPÖ coincided strongly with immigration. In the end of the 1980s and early 90s, there were the Yugoslavian wars, and a lot of asylum seekers came into the country, and the FPÖ used this as a kind of as a strong argument to go for the FPÖ. And as you know, the FPÖ again has become part of the government, and only in recent election after the scandal they lost a lot of vote, but they're still holding more than 50% of the votes even after the scandal. Now, what did we do in our study? Okay, we asked the question: did high immigration locations in Austria vote more for the FPÖ? And this is a reasonable question to ask, because there's a lot of variation across locations in the immigrant share. Okay? So if you take the 2011 census, the immigrant share was more than 10%, but the standard deviation across locations was almost as large as that. So essentially this means we have many locations where there are very few immigrants, and other locations where there are a lot of immigrants. And over time, of course, you have also changes, differential extent of changes across these locations. And this variation can be used to learn something about the growth of the rise of the FPÖ. Okay. So we are looking at 7 national elections, and we have voting outcomes on more than 2,000 municipalities, and we use census data that give us, let us characterize in a very, very detailed way municipalities, okay, by characteristics of the local electorate and municipality characteristics themselves. So what we find is that local immigration indeed significantly positively affects local votes for the FPÖ, but actually the effect is not so large. To give you an idea, we find that a 1 percentage point increase in local immigration increases FPÖ vote shares by 0.16 percentage points. So in total we can roughly explain roughly 10% of the regional variation in FPÖ support. Okay? We also find that the effects that we see are consistent with the voters worrying about labor market problems, as the economic narrative would suggest, but also about neighborhood quality. Okay? And of course, what you need to take into account when you do such an analysis, you make sure that the effect that you estimate is not contaminated by location choices of immigrants and natives. For instance, if immigrants avoid locations that are very xenophobic, then you kind of destroy any effect between immigration and voting, because the reverse causality destroys the effect. Differently, it could be that native voters leave locations where a lot of immigrants come in. Okay? And you make sure that you account for that in order to really estimate a causal effect of immigration on vote shares. Now, a second example I want to give you is a similar study for Italy. Now we're talking a lot about Italy and Matteo Salvini and his very xenophobic Lega Nord, but this has a long tradition in Italy, and the predecessor of Salvini, Umberto Bossi, whom you see on this campaign poster, they had a very strong anti-immigration attitude already in the past, and an interesting study for Italy by Barone and co-authors actually studies the support for the Casa della Libertà. That was back then a platform that Berlusconi formed with the Lega Nord and the Alleanza Nazionale, and this platform took a very strong anti-immigration stance as well. And they did a similar study than we did, and they find that a 1 percentage point increase in immigrant share leads to a 0.86 percentage point increase in vote shares. So a substantially larger effect than we found. Okay, of course, the context is different. The data are different, but here we see that it seems to depend a lot on the context. What is the impact? How strong the impact of immigration on vote shares is. This Italian study also finds that the effect is very large in small municipalities, but is non-existent in big cities, and is also particularly strong when immigrants are culturally different from the native population. Okay. Now, as a third example, I want to give you an example for Switzerland. Okay. And in Switzerland, a specific thing of the political system is direct democracy, so there are votes on all kinds of issues, inter alia also on immigration policies or anti-immigration policies. Okay, this is from the Masseneinwanderungsinitiative that eventually got accepted by the voters. And as you can see from this was a campaign poster by the right-wing party in Switzerland, the SVP, okay, and says that we should stop mass immigration. Okay. Now, two former PhD students of mine have studied 27 referenda on immigration topics in Switzerland. For each referendum, you can clearly say this: if you vote in this or the other way, you are either pro or against immigration. Okay? And they also find that a higher extent of immigration in the location where you vote is associated with a higher increase in yes votes in anti-immigration referenda. Again, like in the Italian study, they find that the effect is driven by culturally different immigrants. So if there are Germans or Italians around you, you don't care. But if they are from Turkey or maybe from Syria and so on, then Swiss voters care much more. They also find that the vote share of the populist Swiss People's Party in national elections is also strongly affected by the presence of immigrants in a location. Okay? So there's an emerging literature, and I just gave you 3 examples, but there are many more studies out there that actually find very similar things. If you look at this table here, you will see that at the very bottom I mentioned 2 studies where they find effects that go in the opposite direction. And actually one study is by Andreas Steinmeier, who looked at a particular election that took place after the summer 2015, when we had the Syrian refugees. And actually, what he finds is that there were many communities in Upper Austria that had houses, free houses, where they could host those refugees. Okay? And he finds that actually in those communities that hosted refugees, the increase in votes for the FPÖ was smaller than in other locations that did not host asylum seekers. And this is kind of support that at least in the short run, this contact hypothesis that I mentioned before, that being in touch and interacting with immigrants may actually be may relatively reduce xenophobic attitudes. Okay. Interestingly, there's another study for France that studies support for the Front National that finds similar results. Okay, so to summarize, immigration and voting is a growing literature. The majority of studies finds that immigration increases support for right-wing populist parties. The effects differ strongly by urban and rural area, by ethnicity of the immigrant group, by the skills of immigrants, and also partially between asylum seekers and economic migrants. One thing is that, of course, that needs to be mentioned is that the comparability of the studies is quite limited. There are different time periods, data sources, of course the context, the country context is different, and also the level of aggregation at which you study observe immigration and voting differs across these studies. What we need to make progress here are studies that are well comparable and that take country experiences into account, in particular also that are able to evaluate the effects of integration policies against the background of the particular institutions that specific countries have. Okay. And okay. So this is about the first aspect of the globalization process, immigration. Now let me talk about the second dimension of globalization that is important in the context of voting behavior, namely import competition. The question is, did exposure to import competition from low-wage countries change political preferences? Let me start with this graph. This is actually from David Dorn and his co-authors who studied the rise of Chinese imports and how it affected the US manufacturing sector. So the time series starts in the late 1980s up until the year 2007, before the financial crisis. And what you see, this is the blue rising graph here, is that Chinese import penetration was increasing very strongly. Okay. At the same time, the there was a decline in the manufacturing sector. This is a red dotted line, and you see these two time series just go in opposite directions. And there seems to be a close association between the two. Now what Otto, Dorn and Hansen did is they asked the question, how did rising import competition affect US local labor markets? Okay. And the basic idea is local labor markets are different because they are differentially exposed to import competition from China. So Silicon Valley is not exposed to import competition from China because they are kind of producing high tech services, but other locations where the manufacturing sector is prevalent, these firms come under pressure and have to compete with those Chinese firms, have to downsize. Many firms actually have to close down. And this harms the local labor force. And the result that Otto, Dorn and Hansen achieve is that the decline in the US manufacturing employment is to a large extent can be explained by exposure to Chinese imports. Okay? Now this is about the US, and we are talking about Western Europe, so how is the situation in Western Europe? So on this graph I drew, starting out from the year from the to the in the very left up left. We start in the early 90s and see that the manufacturing share in employment in Western Europe was still above 20%. Okay, and Chinese imports were irrelevant. Okay. Now Chinese imports were increasing over time, and at the same time manufacturing employment was decreasing over time. And there's a very, very close association between the two. Okay. And this suggests that also in Europe, actually the same mechanism, maybe with some delay, should be at work that we saw, that we have extensively been documented in the US studies. Okay. Now, what does the empirical evidence tell us about import exposure from low-wage countries and voting behavior? Again, let's first look at US studies. Here again, David Dorn and his co-authors looked at how this Chinese imports has affected voting behavior for the Republican Party in the US. And they find a strong, significant relationship, and they conduct an interesting thought experiment. They ask what would have happened to voting behavior if Chinese input penetration would be only 50% of what it actually was. What they find, and this result is striking, is that in 3 swing states, namely Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, not Republican candidates, but Democrat candidates would have been elected. Okay? But this would mean that Hillary Clinton would be the US president rather than Donald Trump. Okay? So here it seems that that Chinese import exposure has a decisive effect on the voting outcomes. Again, let's look, this is about the US, but let's look at European experience. So there's one interesting study by 2 colleagues, 2 political scientists from Bocconi University in Milan, Colantoni and Stanik, that look at Western European regions and study more than 70 elections over the period 1988 to 2007, and they find that actually that an increase in Chinese import penetration is to a large extent responsible for the increases in votes for the radical right. And if you compare their numbers, let's say a 1 standard deviation increase in votes for the radical right increases vote shares for the for the populist right-wing parties by 1.7 percentage points. This is a relatively strong effect, even as the effect on immigration that we saw for some other countries before. Also, comparing these effects directly is, of course, kind of complicated. This study is supported by single country studies that also find a significant effect of import exposure on voting behavior. For instance, there's a study for France and another study for Germany that find similar results. So there seems to be clear evidence that import competition shifts voter preferences towards right-wing populist parties. Okay? So the idea is that the import competition generates these locations that are structurally weak, that have experienced a lot of manufacturing decline, and in this location there's a lot of discontent that goes in favor of the right-wing parties. Okay. Now, one problem of these studies is certainly that the data that are easily available are on a very high level of aggregation. They use NUTS 2 or in Germany even NUTS 1 regions, and this cannot be considered, these are very large regions that cannot really be considered as local labor markets. Okay? So this is certainly one dimension where literature needs to improve. And the other thing is that most of these studies look at support for the right-wing, or focus very strongly on support for the right-wing parties. But at the same time, what took place, and I showed you the graph at the very beginning, is that that Social Democrats lost so much support. Okay? And finally, I want to also emphasize that we lack cross-country evidence that looks at the combined effect of immigration and import exposure. And it's not clear whether or not there are interactions between these two processes of these two outcomes of the globalization process. Now this brings me to the final part of my lecture, namely I will show you some empirical evidence from an ongoing project that I conduct with my colleague David Dorn from Zurich. So the main idea of the project is, first of all, we need to have comparable data across countries at a finer regional level that is currently available. So we are we put together a data set that looks at NUTS 3 regions, that gives us a relatively fine regional classification, and it's much easier to claim that the NUTS 3 region is a local labor market than the high aggregated NUTS 1, NUTS 2 regions that were used in previous studies. This is one thing. The other thing is that we want to particularly also look at the fall of the Social Democratic vote shares, which was particularly strong since the mid-2000s. And eventually we want to look simultaneously at trade and immigration. Not only trade from China, but in Europe, also trade from Eastern Europe is very relevant. That may have had similar effects than import exposure from Chinese to Chinese firms. Okay, and the caveat is that all the results that I show you from now on are preliminary. I'm pretty confident that there will be no big changes until the final version of the paper that we will eventually write, but they are preliminary. So we're talking about 16 countries, EU 15 except Greece, for which we don't have data, plus Norway and Switzerland. We have more than 1,000 local labor markets. These are NUTS 3 regions with some adjustments that we make. And we can look at 118 elections. These are all elections to the national parliaments in these 16 countries that took place between 1990 and 2018. Okay. And I will show you some descriptive evidence First, let's look at Western European countries as a whole, Western Europe as a whole. Then I will talk about country-level evidence, and then I will talk about regional evidence. Okay. Now, first, let's look at treat Western Europe as a single country, and look how this our vote shares evolve in this country. So we see that, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, the Social Democrats started out from more than 35% in the early 90s, and by 2018 the vote share has decreased to 22%. So a strong erosion of the voter base of Social Democrats. At the same time, right-wing populist parties were still relatively unimportant in the early 90s. In Western Europe as a whole, they had less than they had only 2.5% of the votes. But by the year 2018, this share has increased to 10.5%. Interesting observation is, of course, that the losses for the Social Democrats were substantially larger in Western Europe as a whole than the gains of right-wing parties. And the other thing is that the losses for the Social Democrats occurred mainly after the year 2004. Okay? And because this is very recent, this may explain why the literature has focused so strongly on right-wing parties and has not focused very much on Social Democrat, on the vote share losses of Social Democrats. And in relation to the literature I've discussed before, what we want to do is we want to relate these voting trends to the decline in manufacturing employment that may be triggered to a large extent by Chinese imports, but also by imports from Eastern Europe, and by the increase in immigration. Now, let me show you first this graph. The blue graph here shows how the right-wing votes have changed over time. So we normalize the year 1990 to 0 here. So what we see here is a deviation, the increase in vote shares since 1990. And on the horizontal axis, we see the share of workers in manufacturing. Okay. And the share in workers of manufacturing declined from 22%, this is the very left, on the very left of the scale, to 14 percentage points is on very right scale. So we want to kind of say where is the decline in the manufacturing very strong, then we are on the right of this graph. Okay? So what we see is that there's the rise in the vote shares for the right-wing parties goes hand in hand with the decline in the manufacturing sector. And similarly, the fall in the vote shares for the Social Democrats is not strongly related to the manufacturing decline up until the year 2000, to the mid-2000s. But since 2008, the vote share of the Social Democrats is collapsing. At the same time, we see further de-industrialization. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you look, we can do the exact same thing by looking at immigration. So on the horizontal axis here, we have the increasing share of immigrants. And the blue graph again is the increase in vote share for right-wing parties. The red is again the decrease in the vote share of the Social Democrats. And if you look at this graph, again after the year 2004, which would be this, this data from this data point here, we see a very close association between the increase in the immigrant share and the decline in the vote share for Social Democrats. Okay. So this was, if you look at Western Europe as a whole, we see a clear trend. Not only the right-wing vote share increases with the exposure to trade and immigration, but since the year 2004, we see a very close association between these globalization trends and the fall of social democratic parties. Now let's look at, go one level of aggregation deeper, and let's look at countries and how within country variation is associated with within country variation in globalization. Okay, so this is here we see vote shares for social democratic parties, and it's a deviation from the long-run mean within the country. Okay, so let's look at this data point here. This would be the vote share for the Austrian Social Democrats in the year 2013. Okay? This data point would tell us that compared to the long-run average, Social Democrats had 5% lower votes. Okay? And this was, the year 2013 in Austria was a year where immigrant share was more than 5% above the long-run average. Okay? So what this graph tells you, that there's a clear negative association between increases in immigrant share and the fall of social democratic votes. Okay? Now this is something about which we are not talking much, because we are talking most of the time we are talking about increase in immigration, an increase in the vote share for the right-wing party. But what we see here is a striking negative association between increase in immigration and fall of social democracy. Okay? Now what we can do is we can look only at the data points before the year 2004. Okay? This would be the light red data points, and no such correlations exist up until the year 2004. All this emerged after the year 2004. Maybe it strongly emerged after the financial crisis. Okay. And by the way, I mentioned this before. I think the fact that this is a relatively recent phenomenon is probably the reason why it has not been very much studied so far. Now we can do the same thing, the exact same thing for right-wing parties, and we get this picture here. Okay? Now what is striking, if we take the two together, okay, this is just a graph that puts all vote shares for the Social Democrats and all vote shares for the right-wing parties together, we see that the association between immigrant share and vote shares is more strongly correlated for the Social Democrats than it is for the right-wing parties. This is just saying that this downwards sloping line is relatively steeper than the blue line. Okay? And this is a consistent picture that we get. If you look at manufacturing decline, this is what we see for the Social Democrats. Again, up until the year 2004, there is not much of a correlation. This emerges only after 2004. If you look at the association between decline of manufacturing and the right-wing parties, we see a positive association. If we put the two together, we again see that the slope of the red line is steeper than the upward sloping line for the blue, meaning that the correlation between voting behavior is between the fall of social democracy and the globalization indicator here, the manufacturing decline is stronger than it is for right-wing parties. Finally, we can do this for China trade, and we get a similar picture. Okay. Now this is at the country level. The next level of aggregation would be the regional level. So we can ask within region, how did these vote shares evolve in response to globalization indicators? Okay. So the granularity of the data is shown in this graph. So these are not 3 regions. So it's a relatively fine level of disaggregation. And we claim that this comes much closer to the definition of a local labor market as was done in previous studies. Now, if you do we can do the exact same thing, but now we do it at the regional level. Okay. And these are bins, so we would have much more observation than that, but we summarize the data points into bins that have either high or low share of immigrants, and summarize their voting outcomes. And what we again see is a very strong negative correlation between increase in the share of immigrants and the vote share for the Social Democrats. Here at the regional level, we see a stronger association with a right-wing party, with the rise of right-wing parties. Okay. Now, if it comes to manufacturing decline, we again have a very strong negative association with social democratic decline, but a weaker correlation with the increase in the right-wing parties. Okay. Now, this essentially brings me to the end of my talk. So I started out with the observation that right-wing populist parties gained a lot of votes, but at the same time the Social Democrats lost many votes. And quantitatively, at least in the last 10 to 15 years, the loss of the Social Democrats is much larger than the gain of the right-wing parties. And I hope that I also convinced you that there's probably a significant relationship between globalization trends, meaning import competition and immigration, with voting behavior, both for the loss of the Social Democrats and the increase of the right-wing parties. And it also seems that these globalization indicators are more strongly correlated with the losses of the Social Democrats than they are with the gains of the right-wing parties. I think this is what we find a striking feature, and where we want to dig deeper in the research that we want to pursue now. Interestingly, this stronger correlation holds at all the levels of aggregation. We see it for Western Europe as a whole, we see it at the country level, and we see it at the regional level. Okay, so there seems to be something going on in the data that supports this. And of course it is important to understand the conditions under which these voting outcomes are particularly affected by globalization. After all, the political backlash is, so to say, a dissatisfaction with the status quo, and we want to better understand how this comes about. In particular, for instance, if it comes to immigration, we want to better understand which integration policies reduce the support for anti-immigration sentiment, anti-immigration platforms. We don't necessarily want to cut down our borders for immigrants, but we want to make sure that immigrants are better integrated and less perceived as problematic, as is claimed by these right-wing populist political platforms. Another question is, why doesn't globalization reach all parts of the population? After all, economic theory would tell us globalization is a good thing because we can eventually, by appropriate redistribution policies, make everyone better off. Yeah? But this actually does not take place. We see that low-skilled workers are losing ground in their labor market opportunities, and we see increases in wage inequalities and so on in many countries. So this group of the population does not benefit from the globalization process, and there needs to be probably we need to take political steps to address exactly these problems. Now finally, an interesting question is why are social democratic losses so closely associated with the globalization process? Okay. Now, one, if you think about immigration, many social democratic problems have problems to have clear political positions on immigration. Okay. There are a lot of internal conflicts, and this may be one reason. Of course, another reason is that to the extent that the manufacturing sector declines, this also means that there is an erosion of the traditional voter pool of social democratic parties. So in somehow a mechanical way, social democrats will lose votes to the extent that the manufacturing sector is shrinking. Okay. Now, another interesting hypothesis that was mentioned by Thomas Piketty in one of his recent papers is that the social democrats over time have been increasingly supported by the educational elite. So meaning that which was traditionally a party of blue-collar workers has become increasingly a party of where also high-skilled individuals and highly educated individuals are voting for, and this creates a lot of tensions within the party that are difficult to resolve. All right, so that's what I have to say about globalization and voting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And now there is time for your questions, comments. Feel free. Professor Zweimüller.
So let me start. Somebody has to start. So thank you very much. This was really very inspiring and excellent research. I have a question which goes a little bit further, and I wonder if you, for instance, looked at also foreign direct investment, right? Because that's also part of globalization, and a number of Western industrial firms opened up manufacturing plants in China and so on and so forth, and may have transferred some of their production there, so it might not be so much, or there could be an additional channel where you lose manufacturing jobs and in a way create less support for the workers. And I wonder whether within your country, this is the second aspect, whether in your country or regional differences, you have differences in how much sort of trade adjustment policies have been effective, where in some countries or regions workers were more retrained, compensated, moved, therefore might shift votes less than in those countries or regions or time periods when they were not.
Right, so the short answer is we did not look at foreign direct investment. And one reason is, but I completely agree that this may be an important mechanism, just, transferring jobs from the home country to some low-wage country as import exposure may pretty much result in the same outcomes in terms of voting. By the way, there are several studies out there that look at automation and how the automation process that also erodes the job opportunities for low-skilled workers effects, and studies like that address this find also impacts on. So there's potentially very much in there. It's maybe somewhat difficult empirically to find exogenous variation in foreign direct investment, but maybe we should need to think harder about this. Yeah. And the other question, if I understood it correctly, is about the institutional context in the various countries and how the globalization process may differentially affect the outcomes. This is research that we need to do. This is kind of what I could show you today is our first steps. But it's clear to us that we, in order to understand what's going on politically, you also need to take into account the institutional context.
Okay, thank you for the interesting presentation. I was wondering whether you looked a bit at the policies promoted by Social Democrats. Is it that the same policies are not effective anymore in supporting low-wage workers? Or is it that their policies change and now they focus on specific groups and maybe these workers feel like they are somehow, they do not feel that this party supports their needs and it's not concerned with their needs. Okay, I guess it's very difficult to look for all countries, but maybe just if you have some intuition about this. Thank you.
I mean, I don't have any empirical evidence that I could, but I can say what I think. And of course, the Social Democrats, to a large extent, were the party that introduced and expanded the welfare state. Now we need to do all kinds of reforms to the welfare state. And the Social Democrats, where they are in power, need to cut back the welfare state. And I think this may be one important channel through which that may have led to the vote losses of the Social Democrats, particularly after the financial crisis. Yeah. And maybe so we need to think about exactly this in the context of our analysis. But this would probably mechanisms that don't play at the regional level. So because of course eventually we want to focus on regional variation, explaining regional variation. So within countries where all regions are exposed to the same welfare programs, this would not contribute to that, but at the country level, of course, this is potentially important.
Hello. Thanks very much for the input. And
okay.
Yeah, thanks very much for the input. And I was also very interested in what you said about the Democrat. And I have been also I'm from Links and part of the Democratic Party. And I wish just to ask if you consider a certain ideological problem in the Social Democratic Party losing voting also, because of the condition that some members are now more socialist, and there is this conflict between socialists and social democrats inside the Social Democratic Party, and that caused a lot of problem also within us. So I don't know if you include this in your research too. Thank you.
I think it's included again at the national level. So, for instance, what some social democratic parties experienced is that parties were split. Think about Germany, where Die Linke just was, at least in West Germany, was previously part of the SPD, but then formed its own party. And this kind of was a reaction to the internal conflict that the party has. To some extent, this is what we see also probably in the data, because in Nordic countries, the left is more split up, and so this kind of increase in polarization may hurt the traditional social democrats and may kind of increase vote shares for the more extreme socialist parties, at least recently since the Great Recession.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Cleona Manahan. I'm the Irish ambassador. So I would like to come back on the FDI one, because this is something that we've seen in Ireland as a result of the downturn, and obviously now there's an upsurge, there is a wariness about FDI and what the impact is on societies, and that the downward pattern, which was expected that you'd see from top down, this really hasn't been realised for everybody. A second question is about the Green Party and whether you've been tracking the demographic that's voting for the Green Party, because again we see a pattern of much younger voters moving back towards Green. Thank you.
I think I completely agree that foreign direct investment is important. It's important particularly for certain countries like Ireland. Yeah? And we have not yet done that, but maybe we should actually collect data on that. We need to think about this. The other thing is the Green Party is a very recent phenomenon, I would say. I don't know, but what we see in a very recent election, like the one in Switzerland, but also in the Austrian election, we saw actually a landslide victory of the Green Party that gained as many votes as the two Swiss Green Parties together. And also, if you look at opinion polls with respect to the German Green Party, they are in some polls they are the second largest party in Germany by now. But this is a relatively recent phenomenon, at least in my perception, and this is to a large extent probably the losses of the Social Democrats are kind of in favor of the Green Party. Yeah. This may again allude to the discussion, the conflicts that are occurring within the Social Democrats. Yeah.
Okay, I have one question and then I pass word to you. Okay?
Yeah, sure.
So being a labor economist, I would like to ask about one particular tool that the government has, and this is the active labor market policies, in particular training programs and these things. I know it's a complete speculation from your side, but do you think there is a chance, especially with the impact of the import competition and loss in manufacturing, there's a chance to reverse this negative trend in terms of the impact on the voting behavior of this in this particular tool? Because I can imagine that helping these people to retrain might not help them in their political attitudes, right? Or it might not be that simple.
I think that this is one part where government can redistribute. We can invest much more in retraining and providing individuals that are hurt by the globalization process with new skills. But one has to also be aware that this has limitations. So if some 50-year-old worker loses a good job, then it may be more difficult to convince him or her to do this than a young worker who can actually benefit a lot by reorienting and investing in skills. And I think this is also what I know from anecdotal evidence. All the workers who are forced to by the labor market offices to participate in training programs, they often say, I only have to do this, otherwise I wouldn't get an unemployment benefit or something like that. So you have to think, at least you have to think very carefully about retraining measures, and of course, they are the one of the tools that should be used more extensively.
Good afternoon. I'd like to ask if you have considered counter-checking the results. I know this is maybe from a different field, like a political science or sociology, with the intensity and the topics in the campaigns in the political campaigns, because I think as an observer, for instance, that in America the trade issues were more prominent, and also immigration for sure, but here in Europe the immigration topics prevailed the trade ones. Thank you.
Actually, ideally, what we want to do with our studies is to do a horse race between the importance of immigration relative to the importance of exposure to international trade, maybe FDI, if we have the possibility to get necessary data. But what we see from the correlation, it was actually also surprising to me, because I thought that the main driver is immigration. But surprisingly, we see a lot of strong correlations with trade exposure. And if you then think about it, then the mechanism that runs through the emergence of these structurally weak, economically weak regions, where you have the big problems, where you see the social democratic voter base erode, and at the same time the big gains of the right-wing parties. I think this is the mechanism that comes through this aspect, this part of the globalization process is probably also very important. And what we see so far in the regional data is that it's not clear which dimension of the globalization process is more closely correlated with voting behavior. This is also something that I found surprising after I looked at the data.
If you look at Switzerland, and I remember your first chart beginning of 1990 going up, you would probably see quite a similar picture where you see the right-wing Swiss People's Party down, number 4, in the 80s at least for certain, the 4th biggest party, and now the biggest. But in the recent election, as I mentioned, they lost. Although migration was a topic at least 4 years ago, you mentioned we had the mass immigration referendum accepted. The party they won the elections. Now 4 years later, they lost the election. Whereas the Social Democrats, they lost overall, but not so much. It was mainly the central parties which lost in Switzerland. How does this fit into the picture? And that the right-wing party lost now, is this just, would you say, a short-term phenomenon because Switzerland's economy is still doing relatively well? You mentioned the immigrants are skilled, most of them are skilled. Is Switzerland just a special case?
Yeah, I think Switzerland is definitely a special case in many dimensions, probably also in politics, because the Social Democrats were never that strong as in other Western European countries. And if you say what happens in recent elections, I think what has become a very dominant theme now, and this is not only in Switzerland but also in other countries, is climate change. And that gives, this is kind of just emerging. And you may ask why now, why not earlier? Yeah? Probably because now we have we have gone through the economic crisis, we got through the debt crisis, now things are becoming better, now we care about other things. Yeah? Actually, before the financial crisis, there was also a lot about talk about climate and the environment. There was a Stern report. There was a lot of debate also among policymakers that we need to do something about this. Then there was a financial crisis, and this was off the political agenda. We were only talking about, banking crisis, unemployment, public debt, and so on. And recently, it seems now there is room to debate about this thing again, and it needs to be seen how persistent this is, and hopefully it is persistent, because in my view, of course, and I guess we all agree, we need to do much more to deal with environmental problems.
You mentioned the difficulty of assimilating immigrants, and certainly the usual complaint is that Western Europe is not as good as Australia or North America in assimilation policies. I wonder if that's true, if there is much difference across the region, and if you have any longitudinal data, because I assume that immigrants through time assimilate, they integrate to a certain level, and perhaps that speed of integration differs in different countries. I think in Switzerland it's almost impossible to get the right to vote, if I'm not mistaken, but that's not true elsewhere. So I just wonder if you looked at people who arrived 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if there would be some interesting message.
So I can say something about Switzerland, because I have done a recent study for the SECO, for the government institution, important government institution in Switzerland, and we studied the economic integration of immigrants that come into the country since the year 2000, and we can see them in social security data and track their economic performance against comparable native workers in terms of age and skill. And what we find is that on average the immigrants in Switzerland catch up. So they are far behind when they enter the country, but after 5 years they have closed the gap. Yeah? And actually on average, so this holds for men and women alike. But how this is in other countries, my hypothesis would be, say in Austria, integration would not be that good as in Switzerland. We had many more unskilled immigrants, and Switzerland, at least since the year 2000, has become a high skilled immigrant country. Of course, for highly skilled immigrants, it's much easier to be successful in the host country as it is for low-skilled immigrants. So my hypothesis would be, on average, Switzerland is doing very well on this dimension, doing better than other countries. That would be my hypothesis, but I don't know, because I have only studied this case. Yeah. I don't know whether this answers your question. Yeah.
I have one follow-up based on the discussion here. So the traditional approach in the Western liberal democratic market economies was to go increasingly for free trade, right? Barriers have gone down over the decades. And then to say there needs to be an adjustment to the painful, adjustment for people. So let's develop active labor market policies, passive labor market policies, and so on, right? Now, recently, there seems to be a shift. You've shown it in terms of the voting, and you see it even in the shift of the parties. Like the Republicans in the United States were always free traders. Now they are for very much protectionist approach. Right? So another horse race here is in public policy. Will we be able to develop trade adjustment policies so as to cushion the adjustment and stay with free trade, holding other reasons why free trade might not happen constant? Or will there be a shift by the mainstream, whoever dominates the policy forum, towards protectionism? Is there research, any data that you have anything to say on that? Because that's a key issue, right? That's really...
I completely agree to that. I think from the work we are doing here, we cannot directly look, or actually this is not the aim of the project, because the aim of the project is eventually to understand the differential experiences of local labor markets, rather than, at least not directly, kind of the policies that are pursued at the national level. Right. Although I completely agree that eventually the responses in local labor markets will depend on the particular policies that are adopted or have been adopted in the past. Some policies may be disastrous, other policies may help the regions that are hurt, and therefore you may see very different responses.
I guess a short-term proxy might be the degree of softness or performance of the labor market. Labor markets that have low unemployment are not shocked as much, might adjust differently than the labor markets that have high unemployment, and those data you have, right? So the labor markets where you don't have much unemployment, it's as if you had good trade adjustment policies because workers don't feel the pain, whereas in the other ones they feel the pain.
Okay, one more question here.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation, Professor. Regarding the immigration phenomenon, there is a case in Bavaria, Germany. And I think actually Bavaria is one of the regions where has experienced and been considered as most ethnically diverse in Germany. And before the Germany Chancellor migration policy in 2015, the results of Bavaria elections in 2013, they could not gain any single seat. And then the result of recent Bavaria elections in 2018 quite shocked people when the AfD has unprecedentedly won seats more than SPD. And so my question is that, what do you think about this phenomenon? Why the elections in such most ethnically diverse regions, who has been familiar with migrants, turn out to this direction?
Difficult question. Actually, this is one hypothesis in sociology that I mentioned by Putnam. He says that social cohesion may erode if societies get ethnically increasingly dispersed. So this would, what you are saying with the German example, would support that hypothesis, I would say. In principle, we could look also at ethnic diversity. We have not calculated that data, but this data would actually be available at the regional level. Yeah, we have to some extent, we know where the immigrants come from. So we could look at the composition of immigrants and how the particular composition affects the outcomes that we are looking at. Actually, this is something we want to do anyway, but we are not yet so far to be able to show something. It will still take us some time because it was really a pain to and still is a pain to get all the data together to make it really comparable across countries and also comparable across time.
Okay, thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Professor Zweimüller, for your presentation and answers. It was really nice having you here.
Thank you very much.